Ladies and gentlemen, James Bevan.
Listen, I get a kick-off fast because, as Yuri has said, we have remarkably little time and we have a lot to talk about. And I want to talk about the challenges of globalization because the promise has been great, but frankly, the delivery has been remarkably limited in the context of what people legitimately expected and most certainly required. And this picture carries an awful lot of messages, but we have choices. And we have choices to which way we go. Will we have the encouraging future, the automated BMW, the new technologies to which prior speakers have referred, or do we have the challenges of social exclusion, financial poverty, and the wreckage associated with climate change? But to contemplate these challenges, I do think we need to have a framework, and a framework that is bedded in genuine economics. And it does seem very clear to me that when one contemplates the enormity of what has to be done to move the world to a better place, we need to begin with the premise that top of the tree is good governance. We have to anticipate that people will make the right decisions for the right reasons. But the second key issue to which prior speakers already referred has got to be the importance of technology in supporting change, in driving change, and ensuring that no one gets left behind. Because if we don't have social buy-in, we will not have the rule of law, we will not have public support. But this issue about who gets what and why is a challenge that is as old as the hills. And if one goes back to the first basic textbooks on economics, this division between land, labor, and capital has been there forever and a day. And indeed, if you were to go back to the Middle Ages, the great shifts of wealth were largely associated with what people did and how it worked. So the little picture on the left actually came in the wake of the Black Death, when there simply weren't enough people to deliver crops that were grown. So there was a shift into livestock, and the shift into livestock then led to a material change in farming patterns and wealth creation. It led to the rise of the wool industry in the UK, which then required global shipping in order to be able to deliver real wealth for the merchants in the UK. But it wasn't all plain sailing. So the map on the right-hand side, people, it was all about the peasants' revolt. It was people saying, look, you know, you lot get rich, but what about us? And therefore we can observe that over time, these real issues about what is fair, what is reasonable, and how sustainable may it be are testing challenges. And behind all of this, of course, there has been the huge significance of technology. And it's very clear that the pace of technology has increased. Now, I've deliberately not used a logarithmic chart. Interestingly, we had roughly a threefold increase in the period that became known as the Great Depression at the end of the 19th century, when we had refrigeration, we had the advent of steamships, and we therefore had Argentinian beef coming over to Europe and destroying the framework of agriculture in Europe, but also permitting the rise of industrialization and the birth of new cities. And if you look at the history of British football clubs, an awful lot of them are associated with this period as people were shifted from the countryside into the towns, began to find they had adequate time for leisure, and then began to support football. Very visibly, we can see that globalization in technology has been very substantial, but it's not just been technology that has been the driver of change. If I were to think about some of the major changes that have occurred in globalization in the post-war period, I would say that the three main drivers of difficult change were the admission of first Japan, and then Korea, and then China into the World Trade Organization remit of free trade. Because all three countries were admitted on terms that, frankly, wouldn't pass muster if one were fair and honest and open about what was required to be part of the club. Now, in the case of Japan, it was in the post-war period. There was an appetite to rebuild an economy and to introduce democracy. With Korea, it was clearly a bulwark against North Korea. It was an opportunity for America to flex its muscularity on the global stage and recognition that there needed to be some capitalist support. With China, there was the absolute recognition that if there was to be change that was peaceful, it needed to come through an increase of wealth. But that was only part of the story, because the flip side of what was going on with the introduction of these economies into the world trade system was an absolute recognition that actually people were becoming part of the problem for global capitalism. So this is a map taken from Canada of the labour share of GDP. And you will see that there was a remorseless increase up to the 1970s, and there was a very difficult and unattractive cabal of developed economies that needed to find a way forward in terms of reducing the power of the labour force and emerging markets that wanted to have a faster track of growth. And they built this very interesting balancing act. And you will see that it teeters on the edge because it is fundamentally unstable. But on the one hand, we had emerging economies that wanted to overproduce relative to the needs of their own economies, that were under-consuming and therefore had high savings rates. They wanted to replow those savings rates into the world capital markets, providing goods, services, and capital. On the other hand, we had the US and others who we know for a prolonged period underproduced relative to their consumption needs. And we talk about the challenge of global consumption. We need 3 planets if we're to feed the standard of living that we are enjoying here in Athens or over in London. But nevertheless, the reality is that the US and others have significantly underproduced relative to their own requirements. They have overconsumed, they've had inadequate savings, and as a result, they have imported goods, services, and capital. And these are significant issues because this balancing act, this trade-off between the interests of both parties, did lead to a very significant step down in the slice of the economic pie that went to labour. And in some economies, it's been much more extreme than that. So that was Canada. This is Australia, a very, very significant prolonged downturn. Mapped against that, of course, there was a reduction in the formal power of labour as evidenced by union membership. Now, for a while, everything looked magnificent. If you were to look at UK productivity, we went up in a nice straight line, we went sideways, and everybody thought, do you know, this isn't too great. Labour's getting too uppity, it's taking too much of the slice of the cake. We're going into the 3-day week to which Yuri referred, productivity fell off. The unions were then dismantled by Mrs. Thatcher in the UK, but also by Ronald Reagan in the United States and subsequently Helmut Kohl, Germany. And we got this re-acceleration, and everybody thought that was fabulous and the game had moved. And then we had the global financial crisis. And the global financial crisis demonstrated how fragile this productivity improvement had been, because in the UK, we have made some very significant shifts. What we had done is varied the contribution of the economy away from manufacturing being the red line into services being the blue line, the big service providers in the UK economy being financial services. So we built a banking sector where the output of the banking sector essentially was a product of the amount of leverage in the system. So not real productivity at all, but simply how much money could be deployed in the system. And the second aspect of what happened through this long period of change was a shift up in inequality. So here is the Gini coefficient, and the higher up you are, the less even is your economy, and therefore the more irritated people are with what's going on. Now, if the world sort of stabilized over time, these things will work through. The problem, or the fly in the ointment, however, is that whereas average wages in China have been rising, export prices in China have been relatively stable. And this is not a miracle of productivity, but this is outright subsidy, and hence Mr. Trump's great claim that he wants fair trade, not free trade. And the backdraft of this shift in terms of trade, this shift in the relative pricing of labour in different economies, is, of course, the reality that although global core inflation has fallen, indeed in global trade terms, at the moment we are facing outright deflation, and you will be very aware of this, global manufacturing wage trend inflation has been falling too. And this inevitably has been the backcloth to the fall in wage income as a percentage of GDP, which was one of the drivers of Mr. Trump's political success, and then inevitably his determination that he would apply tariffs into the global trade system to try to secure a better deal for his voting public. And I have to say that this comes at a point where global trade has been about as supportive for the global economic system as is possible. And we do have a phase one agreement between the US and China, which is undoubtedly a good thing, but I don't think that we are anywhere close to a long-term solution to the problem. not least because China in global terms is now a much more important trade player than the US. For sure, the US is a bigger economy, but the US economy is largely as big as it is because of internal economic activity rather than external trade. And again, you will recognize this extremely well. And the economies that have done well, therefore, have been those that have been able to benefit from the strength of growth of demand from China, of which Germany has been one. The BMW that we have seen has sold like hotcakes into China as people have determined that that's what they want. And Germany has a problem because if you were to look at its wage costs relative to either Eastern Europe or China, it is expensive. And what it has therefore done is to invest in technology. It has determined that the way it will solve its productivity challenge is simply to spend more on plant and machinery. And I have to say it's worked, because here is a chart at the top of what's happening to labour productivity year on year based on quarterly data for Germany. Everything above the zero line means that they're doing a good job. And I have to tell you, the bottom chart is Greece. Everything below the line is where productivity has been slipping. The competitive advantage, therefore, that Germany has secured relative to Greece since the global financial crisis, this is not leading up to the crisis, this is what happened after the crisis, says that either we need to have currency depreciation, which would be in the traditional way where international competitiveness was restored, or we need to see higher inflation in Germany in order to reduce this advantage that Germany has secured in unit wage costs, or we need to see outright deflation in Greece. And I say that all of those outcomes are remarkably difficult. But this isn't the only story in town or the only game challenge that there is, because we do have the big challenge of what's happening to robotics and automated production systems. So the robot, I would argue, is now the single biggest challenge to peaceful economies. We can see already that technology can lead either to lower prices, enhanced standards of living, superior opportunities to have a peaceful life, or it can lead to really very difficult conditions where people lose their jobs. And this is a photograph of the Carrier air conditioning factory in Indianapolis. Now, you may recall that shortly after Donald Trump was elected, but before he was inaugurated as president, Atlantic, who owned Carrier, said that they were going to close their plant in Indianapolis and they were going to move it to Mexico. Mr. Trump was very quick to tweet and say, no, this isn't going to happen. I've just been elected on a platform that says this doesn't happen on my watch. Money passed hands. And Carrier said that they would keep the factory in Indianapolis. And if you go to Indianapolis, this is what it looks like. And I would say that the most interesting thing about this factory is there are no windows. And the reason there are no windows is there are no workers inside this factory. It is entirely computer-driven systems talking to each other, building units, packing, and sending them back out again. And this is a very difficult future, because what it will mean is that far fewer people will be employed in the long term than we employ today. Now, this isn't a new problem. This is John Maynard Keynes, and he said that the single biggest problem for the 21st century, well, what are we going to do with all the leisure time we have? And he was speaking at a time in the 1930s when we had similar challenges of slow growth, international challenges, real issues about what was going to happen in terms of trade. And you may recall that there were three great economists who talked through the 1930s about the way forward. There was Keynes, and he was humiliated initially. He sort of changed his tune, and he is now regarded as something of a legend in economics. But at the time, he got it horribly wrong and lost a lot of money. The guy who went into this whole period with the greatest reputation, and indeed subsequently was regarded by many people such as Schumpeter as the greatest economist who ever lived, was Irving Fisher. And I included both of these photographs because the one on the right is what most people remember, but I like the one on the left because that ridiculous moustache. And we have to give him a hands up for being prepared to grow something like that in the days of his youth. But he was an economist who 11 days before the Wall Street crash told the US government that stocks had now reached a permanent high and it all was fine. And he didn't just say it, actually he sort of believed it, because he was a major investor in a company called Cardex, which eventually became Remington Rand. And he had bought heavily into the company. Stock price was $58. After the Wall Street crash, it fell to 28. And he was so confident this was a blip from which there would be recovery. He borrowed all the money that he possibly could. he doubled his position, and of course the share price collapsed to $1 and he was bust. And there is one of the real challenges of the day. We have luminaries of great import and scale who simply get it wrong. The other guy in the process, Roger Babson, the guy on the left here, came out smelling of roses because he definitely did say there's going to be a crash. But enter the Canadian on the other side, the man in the red jacket. That's Philip Tetlock. And Tetlock is a rather nerdy statistician, and he determined that what he should do is see exactly what Babson had said and whether it was for real. And Babson had a business, rather like Bloomberg, selling data. And he had a tip sheet, and it was arrow up if you were to buy and arrow down if you were to sell. And Tetlock went through everything and said, do you know what? If you add up all the arrow up and all the arrow down, you would have better just been holding the market right through from beginning to end. But Babson was a great self-publicist. And it's the self-publicists, I have to say, who therefore win the day rather than the hard facts men. But we do know some things about the future. We know that over the very long term, asset fundamentals rule out. We know in the very short term, it is sentiment that drives pricing. And we know that there is a middle section, which is to do with macro and regulatory developments. Now, I think if we're going to get, therefore, the fundamentals right, we have to think really about risk. But risk is very complicated. Now, I absolutely accept you won't be able to read this, and that's deliberate, because the point of this chart, which comes from the World Economic Forum, is that if you think about risk and all the moving parts, it's really very difficult. What we do know, however, is a lot of the engine space of the economic system is poorly deployed. So we sort of rely on theory that we know is bust. Distributions in finance are not normal. People who believe they are lose a lot of money. We know that if you get into high levels of indebtedness, you're going to end up in deep trouble. So all the countries in that pink square at the top have been building debt since the global financial crisis, not using it as an opportunity to cut back and to rebuild their resources. But the elephant in the room, as we've been discussing, is climate change. This is a chart that was popularized by the World Wildlife Fund, Patagonia, before and after 1920 to today. And I thought it'd be interesting to look at some other parts of the world. So this is Canada. Very much the same story. This is North America in the US. And of course, in the US, we have the Texan fields no longer able to support crops, and we have floods. So this is a really very difficult world in which we operate. But I am not without hope, because when I think about globalization, I'm going to conclude by saying that we do have serious, embedded, deep, and almost intractable challenges of resource contention and abuse. And we have to get much better at understanding how those will be addressed. We have aging demographics, which for many economies are going to prove really challenging, very difficult to get economic growth. The number of people fall, because if you're going to get expanding growth, the number of people who work times the output of each person. If that is to rise, we have to have an increment in the amount that each person produces that is at least equal to the declining population. So Germany is in a real bad place on that front. The US, however, comes out relatively well. But behind all that, we have high debt levels, and that, I think, is a very significant concern. Which leaves the two real unsolved challenges or opportunities of the day: policies and populism. Will we, as electorates, vote for a better tomorrow that is fair, that is reasonable and sustainable? Will we become loud and clamoury as people were in the 1930s and drive us to the descent which that period engaged in? For disruptive technology, will we use technology sensibly to find a better way forward? Or will that technology also become divisive and destructive? The future is in our hands, and we should ignore it at our peril. Yuri, thank you so much.